Hey guys, welcome back to Nerd Crave. If you're just joining me for the first time today, we talk about all kinds of things nerdy, from video games to books, comics, all kinds of things. But today we're going to talk about something near and dear to my heart, and that is audiobooks. We're going to do a top 10 list of the best audiobooks for nerds. And this is a list of the 10 best books that I've read in the last year or so that have really made an impression on me, and that obviously are nerdy in one way or another. Audiobooks have always had kind of a stigma, and it's kind of sad actually, but it kind of falls under the same category as watching the movie before you do your essay instead of reading the book or something, where nerds, especially book nerds, they go on and on about the smell of a book and the feel of the pages and the way it looks on a shelf, and you've got your collection. And you know what? Having a physical book collection is fantastic, and some books are absolutely beautiful, wonderfully put together, and they really do look good on a shelf. But you know what? In this day and age, as our attention spans get shorter and shorter, people have a harder and harder time sitting down for a couple of hours and actually reading a good book. However, audiobooks give you the opportunity to listen to a book while you're doing something else, which is fantastic. I spend a lot of time in my car, driving several hours a day, so I can listen to quite a bit of audiobooks while I'm driving. And over the last couple of years, I've listened to at least a couple hours every day, just doing exactly that, driving back and forth to work and that sort of thing. So I wanted to stop and give you a list of my top 10 favorite nerdy audiobooks that I've listened to in the last year or so. By no means is this a definitive top 10 list of the best books of all time. This is just my 10 favorite books that I've listened to in recent history, and I'd like to share them with you. Stick around. Here we go. So, with no further ado, I present my top 10 audiobooks for nerds, starting with number 10. Number 10 is Jurassic Park 1 and 2 by Michael Crichton. If you're alive and breathing in 2020, chances are you are or were a Jurassic Park fan at some point in your life. Spielberg's movies, particularly the first two, were beyond excellent. They defined a generation, and I don't think many of you would disagree with me there. You might know that the movies were based on books, but did you know that Michael Crichton's two best-selling thrillers, Jurassic Park and The Lost World, are, if anything, better than the movies? This comes as no surprise to an avid reader. The source material is often better than the movie, but in this case, the movies were so good. How can you imagine topping it? Well, these two books are read by superstar narrator Scott Brick, bringing a whole new life to the franchise if you've only seen the movies. Aside from having way more detail and quite a bit more suspense, some of the story arc of the characters actually turn out different in the books, and particularly the second book. The Lost World is quite a bit different overall than the movie that's based on it. These excellent books and the top-notch performance by Scott Brick put these books close to the top of this list. Well, I would like to put it close to the top of this list, but there are so many great books, we just have to carry on. So that was number 10, on to number 9. So number 9 is an interesting series of 4 books, known as the Rama series by Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke is the granddaddy of science fiction. If you've never read one of his books, you owe it to yourself to take the plunge. The Rama series is my favorite from his massive library of works. The first book, Rendezvous with Rama, was originally a one-off book, but over a decade later he came back to the story with the help of Gentry Lee, a noted personality around NASA, to create the final trilogy. The first book details the arrival of a massive alien object in our solar system, and a plan for humans to rendezvous with it in a near-future setting. They discover that the ship is uninhabited, and it presents more questions than answers as it continues to speed through the solar system. The descriptions of the alien setting and the philosophical questions it raises are undeniably good. The subsequent trilogy follows the life of Nicole Desjardins as a member of the sortie party initially sent out to meet the spacecraft as it speeds through the solar neighborhood. And then she and a couple of other people end up trapped on the ship as it speeds away from Earth on an unknown trajectory. This moving tale of life and love and anxiety of trying to survive in an alien and often openly hostile environment leads to some very gripping storytelling, and by the end of the series you have followed Nicole and her family through her entire life as she gives everything to protect her family and learn the secrets of the universe. I have read these as books at least 3 or 4 times. I've listened to the audiobooks at least 3 or 4 times. This series is among my favorite science fiction books of all time. Arthur C. Clarke is a pure genius, and I highly recommend these books as my number 9. Moving on to number 8, a series many of you will be familiar with, and that is The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Many of you will be familiar with the Narnia series from the various movies, the BBC animated shows. I grew up with Narnia. My mom read me these books as a child, and maybe some of my recommendation comes from the nostalgia I feel when I listen to these books. There are several different versions of these books floating around in audiobook form. There is a superb set of abridged audio dramas done by Focus on the Family, with multiple voice actors, sound effects, and a beautiful score. And then there's a set on Audible with different voice actors for each book, including the amazing Sir Patrick Stewart narrating the final book, The Last Battle. The Narnia series, over the course of 7 short books, takes you from the moment of creation of the magical world of Narnia in The Magician's Nephew to its final destruction in The Last Battle. Children from our world are instrumental in the major events in the world of Narnia, being pulled into it by magic to save Narnia from one evil or another, and in the process to save themselves. The entire series is a Christian allegory. The religious parallels are too obvious to ignore, but the story is so well crafted and lovable that you really can't hold it against it. The characters in this book, talking animals as often as not, are so memorable. Reapy Cheep the valiant mouse, Trumpkin the dwarf, obviously Aslan the lion as the king of the world. You cannot help but come back to the world over and over to spend time with your closest friends. Any way you can get your hands on these books, I highly recommend them. C.S. Lewis is a master of his craft, and these books should not be missed. Moving on to number 7, this kind of encompasses a whole bunch of different books, but particularly one trilogy within the Star Wars expanded universe, and that is the Thrawn trilogy. If you're a big fan of the original trilogy Star Wars, and generally neutral or worse towards the newer movies, you're in luck. There are tons of expanded universe books set in and around the time of the events of the original movie trilogy. The Thrawn trilogy picks up 5 years after Return of the Jedi as a new threat, Grand Admiral Thrawn, arises to pull together the tattered threads of the old empire and present a new challenge to Luke, Leia, Han, and all your favorite characters. There's 3 action-packed books written by Timothy Zahn to give you a whole new adventure and all kinds of answers to the questions left at the end of the original trilogy. The performance in these books, if you get the Mark Thompson versions available on Audible, are easily as good as the books themselves. They're dramatized, meaning you get music, sound effects, and voice acting unique to several of the characters. I highly recommend these books. They were just so much fun. Moving on to number 6. This one is kind of a controversial book. Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard. Whatever you think of the man who created Scientology, he was a heck of a sci-fi author. Battlefield Earth is a monstrous tome with one hell of an alien post-apocalyptic story. The characters are lively and expressive, the story is engaging, and despite the absolutely awful movie adaptation, this book has inspired an entire subgenre of alien movies and books. You follow the protagonist, Johnny Goodboy Tyler, as a kind of He-Man character as he discovers the truth behind the monsters that rule Earth, and eventually defeats them and saves humanity. Despite the sheer size of this book, and let me tell you, it is huge. I have read it twice, and I've listened to the audiobook at least twice more. Hubbard really sets the gold standard for post-apocalyptic sci-fi that's really only matched by our number 2 book, so stay tuned. Number 5. The Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. Let me say right now, If you are not prepared to spend several hundred hours invested in one book series, maybe this one's not for you. The Wheel of Time is considered by most fantasy readers to be the most impressive series since Lord of the Rings. Wheel of Time has sold over 70 million books worldwide and is now in development for a series on Amazon Prime Video. If you start reading this 15-book mega series right now, you just might be done in time for the launch of the Amazon show next year. With 15 books to work with, it's no wonder that you get some of the best world building and character development you will ever see in any fantasy series. The magic system is incredibly complex and detailed, the battle scenes are huge in scope, and while the plot leans a bit on standard fantasy tropes, like young hero must save the world, it still manages to be extremely creative and not too predictable. All in all, this is a good fit for number 5 on my list, if you have time to read 15 books. Number 4 is an interesting book, and a little bit different from everything else on this list. This is Superman by Larry Tye. Superman is the most recognizable fictional character in the world, hands down. The only other character that comes close would be Mickey Mouse. Ironically, both were born within a few years of each other. The author, Larry Tye, builds a gripping audio documentary that you literally can't put down about the history of the creation, rise, fall, and rise again of Superman. He describes the lives of the creators of Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and the struggles that they had to go through to get the original character to print. Tye follows Superman through the seedy underbelly of the comic world in the 40s and 50s and beyond, and carefully details the development of Superman radio serials, TV shows, movies, and more. The depth of knowledge about everyone's favorite man in tights is not only impressive, but edge-of-your-seat interesting all the way through. If you love Superman, or superheroes, and comic books in general, this book gives incredible insight into the back rooms of comic book companies and Hollywood in general. It's an absolutely fascinating read. And hey, you never know when you might want to impress your friends with some obscure trivia. Moving on to number 3, similar to number 4, this is I Am Spock by Leonard Nimoy. Even if you are not a fan of Star Trek, this is one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. On the backlots of vintage Hollywood, the descriptions of the processes involved in actually taking a TV show from concept to production are completely fascinating, even without the heaps of Star Trek lore. Also, having this book actually read to you by Leonard Nimoy, Spock, for those of you who may not be diehard Trekkies, makes this an absolute gem of an audiobook. His rich voice brings his memories to life and injects a real legitimacy to what he has to say. Some of the things he reveals in his book, like his relationship and constant struggles with William Shatner, and to some extent Gene Roddenberry too, are nothing short of shocking, and put a whole new perspective to some very beloved characters. While it's not a particularly long read, if you consider yourself a nerd, you owe it to yourself to listen to this book. The wealth of trivia alone is worth the listen, and it is beyond charming to hear Nimoy's unique perspective on the franchise. Alright guys, we're getting towards the top of the list, down to the last 2 books, and with number 2, I'm going to recommend The Stand by Stephen King. I'm intimately familiar with this book as I just finished listening to the author's extended version. I don't know if I would recommend the extended version if you're not comfortable with books that take you a month to read. The Stand is one of the most powerful existential experiences you can have in a post-apocalyptic sci-fi. And I can't say enough about Stephen King's character development and world building. You follow a dozen main characters as they survive a worldwide pandemic and begin to come together to rebuild a civilization after something like 99% of the world's population is decimated. There is definitely a backhanded religious theme to the book, a strong God versus the devil backstory that adds some creep factor in the right places, but it can be a bit off-putting if you're not into that sort of thing. All in all, though, one of the most well-written books that I have ever read, and I highly recommend it, whichever version you choose to read. Now for the big moment, guys. Here's my number 1 pick for the best audiobook for nerds. Number 1, it goes to Foundation from Isaac Asimov, read to you by Scott Brick. You may have noticed that more than one book mentioned in this list is narrated by Scott Brick, and man, that is no coincidence. His performances, his depictions of the characters, and their voices are legendary. no less legendary than the author Isaac Asimov, and arguably his best series, Foundation. The first book in this series is set millennia in the future in a super advanced galactic empire, not so different from, say, the Star Wars Empire. The Empire is beginning to decay, and a genius scientist believes that he can predict the future collapse of the Empire based on his science of psychohistory. He predicts multiple waypoints in the collapse and comes up with a plan to mitigate the collapse of the Empire and the inevitable barbarism that will arise by creating a foundation of scientists to build an encyclopedia of all the knowledge of the known universe. Unknown to these scientists, whom he placed on a distant planet at the fringes of the galaxy, they would be responsible for stemming the flow of barbarism by spreading the religion of technology to people who have lost the skills to use it. Foundation is an absolutely fascinating look at humanity's reliance on technology and a gripping tale of winning wars without firing a single shot through diplomacy and economic control. This book is truly as relevant today as when it was written in 1951, and I can't say enough about the performance by Scott Brick, and there are several other books in this series, guys. If you listen to the first book and you like it, there are several other books in the series. The first book is by far the best book. The second book is pretty good. They do tend to go a little bit downhill after that, but I can't say enough about how fantastic this book is. I have read it half a dozen times or more. I've listened to the audiobook half a dozen times or more, and interestingly enough, if you go on Audible, and you can also find it on YouTube and a couple of other places, there were some radio dramas made of this, which are actually quite entertaining. You can find the Foundation radio dramas on Audible. You can buy them pretty cheap, and they're really good. It's really a lot of fun to listen to those old 60s radio dramas. So anyways, guys, that's it for my list. I hope you enjoyed. Stick around, and we'll be making a lot more lists like this one in the future.